On August 17, 1943, the skies above southern Germany were so clear that every drifting cloud looked as though it had been pinned motionless in space. At more than 7,500 meters, the brutal cold froze the oxygen mask to the face of Major Heinz Knock, one of the Luftwaffe's most seasoned fighter pilots. When he lifted his eyes through the fogged canopy glass, the sight before him froze both reason and emotion. A colossal silver river stretched to the horizon, a metallic tide flooding the heavens. It was the formation of American B-17 Flying Fortress bombers, the flying fortresses that Germans both despised and feared. In those first moments, Knock felt as if he was not facing human-made machines, but a natural phenomenon, a vast silver flood, a glacier of steel glittering under the sun. Hundreds of gleaming B-17s advanced as a single entity, locked into the perfect combat box formation. Each was not only a destroyer, but also a fortress, bristling with heavy guns, dozens mounted in the nose, tail, fuselage, and wings. Together, they wove a deadly lattice of interlocking firepower, forming a wall of lead that promised death to any German pilot who dared to break through. Opposing this massive armada were only 40 German fighters. That was all southern Germany could muster that day. The disparity left Knock and his comrades both tense and helpless. They knew well that in war, numbers often decided outcomes. Here, the difference was not merely imbalance, it was absolute. On one side, hundreds of bombers with tight mutual support. On the other, a few dozen solitary fighters. Less than 3 years earlier, the Luftwaffe had reigned supreme across European skies. During the 1940 campaigns, when the Wehrmacht crushed France in mere weeks, German pilots had ruled the air as if it were their private domain. They ranged freely, facing only scattered French squadrons and later the defiant but outnumbered British. Even though Britain resisted fiercely, most Luftwaffe pilots carried within them a conviction of invincibility. But on August 17, 1943, the situation had reversed. Over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the Germans were no longer the hunters, they were the hunted. Each time the vast formations approached from the west, Luftwaffe pilots realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. American industrial power, organized and unleashed as a tidal wave of steel, crashing down upon Europe. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid, known as Mission 84, was far more than a bombing mission. It was a turning point in American strategy. Planners across the Atlantic knew that to cripple Nazi Germany, one could not merely attack its armies. The industrial lifeblood itself had to be struck. Schweinfurt was the hub of ball-bearing production, a seemingly small component but one essential for tanks, aircraft, and warships alike. Regensburg housed the Messerschmitt factory, producing a third of the Luftwaffe's single-engine fighters. To strike here was to strike at the heart and lungs of Germany's war machine. The U.S. order of battle was clear. 146 B-17s of the 4th Bombardment Wing under Colonel Curtis LeMay would hit Regensburg, while 230 from the 1st Wing would strike Schweinfurt. In total, over 370 flying fortresses would deliver simultaneous blows to the Reich's industrial arteries. For the first time, the U.S. launched such a deep daylight raid into German territory, openly challenging the Luftwaffe's defenses. In response, General Adolf Galland mobilized every available unit. JG-1 scrambled from bases in Denmark and Holland, JG-11 from Oldenburg, and JG-26 from Lille and Wevelgem. These were elite units, feared by Allied pilots, boasting aces with dozens, even hundreds, of kills. Yet even they felt dwarfed by the bomber armada. Knock and his comrades knew the math made this battle hopeless. Each B-17 carried up to 13 heavy machine guns. Hundreds of them flying in tight formation created a sky thick with fire. The German fighters would have to punch through thousands of waiting barrels. However skilled, they were still flesh and blood, facing a storm of steel. Knock had been an innovator. In March 1943, he had even devised a tactic of dropping bombs from fighters onto B-17 formations, an odd idea, but one that once brought down a fortress. Yet even he admitted such tricks were pinpricks against a steel wall. Against America's overwhelming mass, every effort seemed symbolic at best. In his cockpit, Noak silently watched the silver birds advancing. He sensed a truth becoming undeniable. This war was no longer decided by brave individuals or clever tactics. It had become an equation of industry and logistics. He remembered the spring of 1940 when he had eagerly hurled himself into dogfights, treating war as an adventure. But by the summer of 1943, that eagerness had turned to a heavy burden. No longer was it a duel between aces in the sky. It was the brutal clash of mass production. The four roaring engines of every B-17 beat like distant war drums. The Steel Army pressed deeper into Germany, undeterred by the waiting Luftwaffe. To Knock, it was not the sound of machines. It was the death knell of a once proud empire. Behind him, Germany still poured everything into war. Factories worked day and night, producing thousands of planes each month, but aircraft required pilots, fuel, and training. Meanwhile, America showed it could replace losses far faster than Germany could. Knock understood that imbalance was the blade driven straight into the Reich's heart. As his squadron accelerated to intercept, Knock drew a long, icy breath through his mask. He knew the next few minutes would turn the sky into a storm of fire. Comrades would fall, machines would blaze and plummet like burning coals. And he knew that even if he survived this fight, tomorrow would bring more. 400 today, 600 tomorrow, 800, then 1,000. In that moment, Knock realized the bitter truth. Germany had entered a war whose outcome would not be decided in the skies, but in the factories across the Atlantic. And no matter how brave he or his comrades were, they were resisting a wave that could never be stopped. Just 3 years earlier, the Luftwaffe had been the absolute pride of the Third Reich. During the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939-1940, when German armor swept across Poland, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France, Goering's Iron Wings had been the hammer striking every fortress. Heinkel, Dornier, and Junkers bombers launched sortie after sortie, clearing the way for the Wehrmacht's advance. German fighter pilots, men like Galland, Milders, and Marseille, became living legends, hailed as modern knights of the sky. In the summer of 1940, as the Battle of Britain erupted, the Luftwaffe commanded nearly 2,700 operational aircraft, while the RAF had barely 700. The Germans believed the skies would soon kneel before them. In those early days, Messerschmitt Bf 109 pilots flew in small groups, diving into dramatic dogfights, downing Spitfires and Hurricanes with superior skill and experience. Confidence in a lightning victory filled every squadron. But then the world began to shift. The war dragged on. Britain did not collapse. The United States, once a bystander, began to tilt the balance with its vast industrial strength. In 1941, after Pearl Harbor, America entered the war. And then the reality that neither Hitler nor Goering had foreseen became undeniable. No one could compete with American industrial might. Heinz Knoke remembered those golden days as if they were a dream already gone. As a young pilot, every mission had felt like a glorious game, victories counted by the stars painted on the fuselage. But by 1943, every takeoff was a sentence of life or death. Comrades fell faster than he could recall their names. Squadrons were increasingly filled with fresh faces, barely trained boys who had logged only a few hours of rushed instruction. Meanwhile, America hurled into Europe not only modern planes, but also a logistical system unlike anything seen before. The greatest difference lay not in pilot skill. The Luftwaffe still boasted aces with hundreds of kills. The difference was in replacing losses. Every German pilot killed left a gap almost impossible to fill. Months of training, equipping, and hardening. For America, a downed B-17 was simply replaced within weeks, rolling off the colossal production lines of Detroit or Seattle. Numbers told the story. In 1942, the U.S. produced 47,000 aircraft. In 1943, 86,000. And by 1944, on August 17, 1943, as American formations poured into Schweinfurt and Regensburg, Knoche realized that every German pilot's individual triumph was meaningless. He and his comrades might shoot down 5, 10, even 20 B-17s in a single battle, but it changed nothing. America could send hundreds more within weeks. Luftwaffe power had once rested on extraordinary individuals, knights of the air. America's power rested on endless production lines, where machines replaced men in creating might. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid exacted a terrible toll on the Luftwaffe. Though the U.S. lost more than 60 B-17s, a record number at the time, German losses were even heavier. Dozens of seasoned pilots were shot down, many never to return. For the Luftwaffe, each of those deaths was a deep wound in an already bleeding body, wounds that could not be healed. Worse still, every time America returned, the numbers grew. In October 1943, Schweinfurt was struck again. The Luftwaffe downed over 70 B-17s, but lost nearly 40 veteran fighter pilots in return. It was a victory on paper, but a strategic defeat. German pilot losses were irreplaceable. American bomber losses were merely a few days of production. In his diary, Knoche once wrote that he felt as if he were watching the future, dark and inevitable. Each time he dove into a B-17 formation, he faced not only the risk of being shot down, but also the crushing sense of futility. It was as though he and his comrades were trying to hold back a flood with their bare hands. The bitterest truth was the change in the very nature of war. In the First World War, pilots had been knights, where honor and individual skill could shift the balance. But by 1943, war had transformed into something entirely different. It was no longer a stage for individual brilliance. It was a battle of industry, logistics, and vast production lines. And in that battle, Germany, however brave, could not win. Knoche remembered a bitter remark from the famous fighter General Galland. "We do not lack brave pilots. We lack everything else." It was true. They lacked fuel after the U-boat campaign failed, lacked raw materials as supply lines were blockaded, lacked well-trained pilots, and above all, lacked time. Across the Atlantic, America lacked nothing. From the summer of 1943 onward, the Luftwaffe became only a shadow of itself. It still claimed spectacular victories, still fielded pilots with extraordinary tallies. But those victories were flickers of firelight in a vast night. For war was no longer measured by enemy planes destroyed, but by the ability to sustain strength month after month, year after year. And on that scale, the balance tilted irrevocably toward America. When Knoche gazed at the sky crowded with silver B-17s, he knew the Luftwaffe was already halfway to its downfall. It was not a sudden collapse, but a slow bleed, day after day, mission after mission. Death did not strike in a single blow, but like a dull knife, cutting again and again until the body was spent. In those tense hours, Knoche could not help but think of fallen comrades, youthful faces, sometimes barely 18, rushed into cockpits only to vanish within weeks. He knew Germany no longer had time to train a new generation. Meanwhile, America produced thousands of new pilots every month, thoroughly trained and well-equipped. The air war over Europe had been transformed forever. From 1940 to 1941, the Luftwaffe had been the hunter. By 1943, it had become the prey. And Knoche knew well there was no turning back. By 1944, the air war was no longer a series of scattered clashes. It had become a relentless firestorm, pouring down on Germany day after day, night after night. If the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids of 1943 had been the death knell, then 1944 was the moment when hell itself opened over the skies of the Reich. By day, thousands of American B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators streamed across the sky like massive rivers of steel, plunging into the industrial heart of Germany. By night, waves of British Lancasters and Halifaxes rose to turn cities into seas of fire. Everywhere, from Berlin, Hamburg, Essen, Cologne, to Nuremberg, German civilians looked up and saw a sky glowing red, thunderous with the sound of bombs. What made the Luftwaffe's plight truly desperate was the arrival of a new warrior, the P-51 Mustang. With long range provided by drop tanks and the Rolls-Royce improved Merlin engine, the Mustang became the ideal bodyguard for the flying fortresses. Before, German pilots had at least a chance, since American fighters had to turn back at the German border, leaving bombers exposed. But from early 1944, P-51s, along with P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, could escort the B-17s from England all the way to Berlin and back. This meant the Luftwaffe no longer had any gap for ambush. Heinz Knock and his comrades soon realized the horror. Each time they dove at a bomber formation, Mustangs came screaming down from above before they could even get close. If the B-17s were an impenetrable steel wall, the P-51s were shining swords, cutting down any German pilot who dared to approach. Air battles turned more and more into one-sided slaughters. Over Berlin in March 1944, more than 800 American bombers, escorted by nearly 900 fighters, struck the Reich's industrial center. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had to stop them. The result? The U.S. lost about 60 bombers. A heavy price, but not crippling. The Luftwaffe, however, lost over 160 fighters and, more crucially, hundreds of veteran pilots. The surviving aces from 1940 and 1941 were falling one by one, while raw recruits lacked the skill to replace them. Knock described the skies over Berlin as a steel tornado. He remembered comrades climbing into the fight, only to become blazing tails plunging into the fields minutes later. The B-17's 50-caliber guns slashed glowing streams of bullets across the air, while the Mustangs pierced German formations from every direction like silver arrows. Screams filled the radio, calls for help, desperate cries of, "I'm on fire," until silence fell again. For German civilians, 1944 was an inescapable nightmare. In Hamburg, the RAF-USAAF Operation Gomorrah turned the city into a firestorm, killing more than 40,000 civilians in a single week. In Berlin, 1,000-ton raids came month after month. Any street, station, or factory could be a target. People lived in shelters more than in their own homes, and nightfall always meant earthquakes from above. But for Luftwaffe pilots, the tragedy was even more bitter. They not only saw their cities burning, but also watched helplessly as comrades died day after day. Orders kept coming from above: intercept, sacrifice, defend the Reich at all costs. But how could they stop steel armadas stretching to the horizon? How could they protect anything when they were outnumbered 10 to 1, 20 to 1, and the enemy's numbers only grew each day? Knock wrote in his diary, "We are no longer fighting to win. We are merely dying to buy Germany a few more days." That confession captured the Luftwaffe's reality in 1944. They still took off, still bravely hurled themselves into storms of fire, but deep down, they knew it was useless. In May 1944, the Americans launched Big Week, a series of raids aimed at annihilating Germany's aircraft industry. In just 1 week, thousands of B-17s and B-24s shredded Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf, and Junkers factories. The Luftwaffe threw everything left into the fight, but it was nothing short of collective suicide. Thousands more planes and pilots were lost. From that point on, the Luftwaffe's ability to recover was virtually gone. By summer 1944, when the Allies stormed Normandy, the skies over France and Germany belonged entirely to the U.S. and Britain. On the beaches, German troops endured endless shelling and bombing without ever seeing their own fighters overhead. Above, swarms of Mustangs and Thunderbolts roamed the fields, hunting every convoy and train. No one in the Wehrmacht still believed the Luftwaffe could protect them. Knock survived many battles, but victory had lost all meaning. Each time he downed a B-17, he knew another was already rolling off an assembly line in America. His fallen comrades, however, would never return. Every ace lost was a wound that could never heal. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was only a shadow. Even desperate measures like deploying the Me-262, the first operational jet fighter, came too little, too late. The jets were few, vulnerable, and crushed before they could make a difference. The skies over Germany no longer belonged to the Germans. They were a hellscape, raining thousands of tons of bombs daily, where every Luftwaffe pilot took off knowing there was a 50% chance he would never return. Young faces fell one after another, while endless lines of Mustangs circled above like absolute rulers of the air. For Knock, the memory of 1944 was one of irreversible collapse. He had once believed in the Luftwaffe's glory, in the pride of aerial combat. But as he saw cities reduced to ash, as he heard civilians weeping in shelters, he understood all victories had become meaningless. This was no longer a duel of pilots. It was the total crushing of an industry by overwhelming power from across the ocean. And from those burning skies, Knock grasped the truth. The Luftwaffe was not just losing a war, it was being erased, day by day, hour by hour. The proud steel wings of the Reich had been reduced to ashes, buried beneath the greatest storm of bombs in human history. By the beginning of 1945, no one in the Luftwaffe harbored illusions of victory anymore. From senior officers to the youngest pilots, all understood that the skies over Germany were lost forever. The so-called Reich's shield was nothing but wreckage, and every pilot who took off knew he was embarking on an unofficial suicide mission. The fuel crisis was the mortal blow. After the devastating American bombing campaigns of 1944, especially once synthetic fuel plants were flattened, Germany's aviation fuel production fell to nearly zero. On many airfields, brand-new Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs sat lined up, but not a drop of gasoline to launch them. Some units even resorted to having oxen tow their fighters across the tarmac, a scene so pitiful that even German pilots felt humiliated. Even when they could fly, restrictions were severe. One training sortie per month. Young cadets rushed through graduation with only a few dozen hours of flight time, were thrown against veteran B-17 crews and Mustang aces. Their survival expectancy was no more than 5 missions. Heinz Knock recalled, "I looked into the eyes of the 18-year-old boys at their send-off ceremony. In them I saw no belief, only the expectation of death, which they knew would come very soon." Meanwhile, America was only accelerating. The bomber streams were no longer in the hundreds, but in the thousands. Above them, skies swarmed with Mustangs, turning all of Germany's airspace into a no-fly zone. Every train, every bridge, every convoy moving by daylight was fair game. The Wehrmacht had no logistics, no air cover, and was crushed piece by piece. This despair exploded in an unprecedented event, the fighter pilots' revolt of January 22, 1945. In Berlin, legends such as Adolf Galland, Johannes Steinhoff, Günter Lützow, and Hannes Trautloft confronted Hermann Göring directly. They denounced his incompetence, lies, and reckless decisions, especially the obstruction of deploying the Me-262 as a fighter. For the first time in history, the Luftwaffe's aces openly challenged their supreme command, but words came too late. Göring, enraged, accused them of treason and even threatened executions. In truth, he knew the Luftwaffe was dead, but no one wanted to admit it. Hitler dispersed these pilots to various units, smothering the last spark of dissent. For the men, it was the final straw. If even obvious truths were denied, then the Luftwaffe had nothing left to cling to. In the final months, some units did receive the Me-262, a jet fighter superior to all Allied aircraft, faster by over 100 km/h. In combat, it could down B-17s or Mustangs with ease. But there was never enough fuel, pilots, or numbers to make a difference. Dozens took off against thousands. Superior technology became a bitter irony, a miracle weapon that could not alter destiny. In his diary, Noak described the last sorties, worn-out engines, fuel shortages, comrades dying like moths to a flame. He said it felt like flying a coffin, every takeoff a near certainty of death. There was no glory, no faith left, only duty and emptiness. By spring 1945, as Allied armies closed in on Berlin, the imbalance had become catastrophic. Thousands of Allied sorties struck daily, while the Luftwaffe could muster only a few dozen fighters in response. The Germans called it Todesritt, the death ride, and indeed most young pilots never returned from their first mission. By April, as the Red Army stormed the capital, the Luftwaffe had virtually ceased to exist. Aircraft fit for combat could be counted on one hand. Some surviving pilots were ordered into suicide units, told to ram their planes into enemy formations, a desperate, senseless act. Others buried their planes, destroyed them, or simply surrendered. On May 8, 1945, when Germany signed unconditional surrender, the Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe's skies, no longer existed. From being one of the most formidable air forces in 1940, in just 5 years it had become ashes, crushed by overwhelming industrial, manpower, and organizational superiority. After the war, surviving pilots like Galland, Steinhoff, and Knoke published memoirs. They did not boast of triumphs, but spoke instead of futility, of helplessness against an industrial war machine. Galland wrote, "On March 6, 1944, when I saw hundreds of Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was over, not on the ground, but in the air." The lesson of the Luftwaffe still echoes today. Individual brilliance cannot overcome systemic power. German pilots, with unmatched skill and undeniable courage, fought like the last warriors of an age, but they could not fight the truth that modern war is decided by production, by fuel, by the ability to replace losses. The United States built nearly 100,000 aircraft in 1944 alone. Germany produced less than half that, with no fuel and no pilots to fly them. It was an equation in which courage meant nothing. Knoke and his comrades did not lose to cowardice. They lost to mathematics, more precisely, to the industrial mathematics of a new era. And so, as the final bombs fell on Berlin, the Luftwaffe vanished as a tragic symbol. The hunters had become the hunted, the eagles of 1940 reduced to ashes by 1945. With their collapse, history closed a chapter, the chapter of the ace pilot era. In its place began a new age, the age of industrialized warfare, where victory belongs to those who can produce more, train faster, and replace endlessly. Knoke wrote in his final diary entry before surrender, "We fought like warriors, but we no longer had ground to defend nor skies to fly. Everything was lost long ago, only we refused to admit it. Now it is clear." And that was the end of the Luftwaffe. A tragic ending, yet a reminder that in the age of industrial war, even the bravest heroes are but small waves drowned in a vast storm of steel.